Hashtag the secret path that turns men into indomitable warriors against life's strikes. Marcus Romano stood in the ruins of what was once his thriving construction business. The concrete floor was littered with final notices, bankruptcy papers, and the dreams he had built over 15 years. At 42, he thought he knew what strength meant. He had built buildings that touched the sky, managed crews of rough men, and survived the economic downturns that crushed smaller companies. But, standing there in the empty warehouse, with creditors circling like vultures and his family's future hanging by a thread, Marcus realized he knew nothing about real strength. The phone rang one last time that Friday evening. His wife Sarah's voice cracked through the receiver. The bank called again. They're foreclosing on the house next month. The line went silent except for the sound of their 8-year-old daughter asking why mommy was crying. Marcus closed his eyes and felt something inside him break. Not just his business, not just his finances, but something deeper. The comfortable illusion that hard work and good intentions were enough to protect the people he loved. That night, Marcus drove through the city streets aimlessly. The radio played success stories of entrepreneurs who bounced back from failure, but their words felt hollow against the weight of his reality. He parked at a small bookstore that stayed open late, seeking refuge in a place where problems seemed smaller and solutions lived between pages. The elderly owner, Giuseppe, recognized the look in Marcus's eyes. Without a word, he placed a worn leather book in front of him. The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. This book, Giuseppe said in his thick Italian accent, it teaches what they don't tell you in business school. How to survive when everyone wants to destroy you. How to win when the whole world is against you. Marcus almost laughed. A 500-year-old book about Italian politics seemed irrelevant to his modern problems. But something in the old man's eyes made him pause. There was a hardness there, a knowledge that came from surviving real battles. Marcus bought the book and drove home to his family's uncertain future. Sarah was asleep, exhausted from another day of fielding calls from angry creditors and worried relatives. Their daughter Emma's drawings still covered the refrigerator, innocent pictures of their family in the house they were about to lose. Looking at those drawings, Marcus felt a rage building inside him. Not the hot, destructive anger he'd felt before, but something colder and more focused. He would not let his family become casualties of his failures. He opened Machiavelli's book and began to read. The first lesson hit him like a physical blow. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. Marcus realized he had spent years appearing successful while being fundamentally weak. He had built his business on hope and handshake deals, trusting that good relationships would protect him when times got hard. But, when the economy collapsed, those same partners who smiled at his barbecues were the first to demand payment and threaten lawsuits. The second principle cut even deeper: it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Marcus had always tried to be the nice guy, the boss who bought lunch for his crew and gave second chances to workers who showed up drunk. He thought their loyalty would carry him through tough times. Instead, he discovered that niceness without strength was just weakness wearing a smile. When the money ran out, his loyal employees were the first to walk away and the last to return his calls. But it was the third lesson that changed everything. Fortune is like a river in flood, which when it rises, crushes everything in its path. But, when the waters recede, those who build dikes and channels can direct its flow. Marcus understood that he had been swept away by forces he never bothered to understand or prepare for. While his competitors built financial reserves and political connections, he had trusted that honest work would be enough. Over the following weeks, as lawyers circled and creditors grew more aggressive, Marcus began applying these ancient lessons to his modern war. He studied every competitor who had survived the economic downturn, analyzing their strategies like a general studying enemy movements. He discovered that the companies that thrived didn't necessarily have better products or more talented workers. They had something more valuable: they understood power. The first transformation came in how Marcus dealt with creditors. Instead of pleading and making promises he couldn't keep, he began speaking their language. He researched their own financial positions, learning which ones were desperate for any payment and which ones were strong enough to wait. With the desperate ones, he negotiated aggressively, offering pennies on the dollar for immediate settlement. With the strong ones, he proposed payment plans that served his timeline, not theirs. The change was remarkable. Where begging had earned him contempt, strategic negotiation earned him respect. But the real test came when his former business partner, David Chen, attempted a hostile takeover of what remained of Marcus's assets. David had been like a brother for 10 years, sharing profits and problems equally. But when Marcus's business started failing, David saw an opportunity to acquire valuable equipment and contracts at bankruptcy prices. He filed legal challenges to Marcus's reorganization plans and spread rumors about financial improprieties to potential investors. The old Marcus would have felt betrayed and responded emotionally, perhaps confronting David publicly or trying to defend his reputation with explanations and justifications. But the new Marcus, shaped by Machiavelli's teachings, responded differently. He spent 2 weeks quietly investigating David's own business operations. What he found was a company stretched thin, dependent on 3 major contracts that could be influenced by well-placed information. Marcus didn't attack directly. Instead, he arranged for key information about David's cash flow problems to reach the right ears at the right time. He cultivated relationships with David's major clients, not to steal them, but to position himself as a more stable alternative if questions arose about David's reliability. When David's largest client began asking uncomfortable questions about project timelines and financial stability, Marcus was there with solutions and reassurances. The strategy worked perfectly. David found himself fighting fires on multiple fronts, too distracted to pursue his attack on Marcus's assets. More importantly, David's clients began to see him as unreliable, exactly the reputation Marcus needed him to have. Within a month, David was calling Marcus, asking for a meeting to work things out like old friends. Marcus agreed to meet, but not as the desperate man David expected. He arrived at the restaurant with detailed financial analysis of both their companies, proposals that would benefit David in the short term while securing Marcus's long-term recovery, and a quiet confidence that made David uncomfortable. Instead of begging for mercy, Marcus offered partnership from a position of calculated strength. "You want my equipment and my contracts," Marcus said calmly. "But you need my expertise and my relationships to make them profitable. I want to rebuild my company, and I need breathing room to do it. We can destroy each other fighting over the scraps, or we can work together and both come out stronger." The conversation lasted 3 hours, but Marcus got what he came for: time, resources, and a partner who now respected his ability to fight back. But Marcus's real education was just beginning. As his immediate crisis stabilized, he realized that survival was only the first lesson. Machiavelli's teachings weren't just about escaping disaster, they were about building the kind of strength that made disaster impossible. The philosopher had written about princes who ruled for decades in a world where most leaders died violent deaths within years. The difference wasn't luck or birthright. It was a systematic understanding of power and human nature. Marcus began studying successful people differently. Not just their public success stories, but their actual strategies for dealing with competition, managing risk, and maintaining control. He discovered that almost everyone at the top had learned the same fundamental truth: the world was not a fair place where good intentions were rewarded. It was a battlefield where only the strategically prepared survived and thrived. The local business community provided perfect examples. Richard Voss owned the largest commercial real estate company in the city. Everyone knew him as a generous philanthropist who supported local charities and youth programs. But Marcus learned that Richard's generosity was strategic. His donations bought him political influence, his charity boards gave him advance information about development plans, and his reputation for fairness made other business owners lower their guard in negotiations. Similarly, Maria Santos had built a logistics empire by appearing to be a small family business while systematically undercutting larger competitors. She used her image as a struggling minority entrepreneur to win government contracts with diversity requirements, then subcontracted the work to the same large companies she had officially beaten. Her competitors never saw her coming because she looked harmless while playing a game they didn't understand. These revelations were uncomfortable for Marcus. He had always believed that success should come from superior products, better service, and honest dealing. But he was learning that in the real world, these qualities were table stakes. everyone claimed to have good products and honest service. The winners were those who understood that business was fundamentally about human psychology, political maneuvering, and strategic thinking. The transformation in Marcus's personal life was equally dramatic. Sarah noticed the change first. Where her husband had once come home defeated by each day's problems, he now seemed energized by challenges. When Emma's school called about bullying problems, the old Marcus would have scheduled meetings and trusted the system to handle things fairly. The new Marcus researched the school's administrative structure, identified who really made decisions, and approached the problem strategically. He discovered that the principal was under pressure from the school board about standardized test scores. Marcus positioned Emma's situation not as an isolated bullying problem, but as part of a pattern that was affecting the learning environment for high-performing students like his daughter. He brought data, solutions, and subtle reminders about his family's standing in the community. The bullying stopped within a week, not because of moral arguments, but because Marcus had made it in everyone's interest to solve the problem quickly. Friends and family began commenting on Marcus's changed demeanor. Some appreciated his new effectiveness and confidence. Others found him calculating and cold. His brother Tony accused him of becoming too political and not the same guy anymore. Marcus understood their discomfort. He was indeed becoming someone different. The question was whether this new person was better equipped to protect and provide for the people he loved. The answer came during a family crisis that tested everything Marcus had learned. Sarah's father had a heart attack and needed immediate surgery that insurance wouldn't fully cover. The family faced a choice between bankruptcy-level medical bills or substandard care. The old Marcus would have felt helpless, perhaps starting a fundraising campaign or begging relatives for loans. The new Marcus approached the situation like a campaign. He researched the hospital's financial structure, identifying key decision-makers and understanding their priorities. He discovered that the hospital was seeking community partnerships for a new cardiac wing and that the surgeon was involved in medical training programs that needed industry support. Marcus didn't have money, but he had something else: connections and information. Working through his rebuilt network, Marcus arranged for the surgeon to meet potential donors for the cardiac wing and connected the hospital with construction contractors who owed him favors. He positioned his father-in-law's case not as charity, but as an opportunity for various parties to demonstrate their commitment to community health. The surgery was performed by the best available team, costs were reduced to manageable levels, and everyone involved felt they had gained something valuable. Sarah was amazed by how quickly and effectively Marcus had solved an impossible problem. But she also noticed something that worried her. "You're becoming very good at getting what you want," she said one evening. "I'm just wondering if you remember why you wanted it in the first place." It was a fair question. Marcus was gaining power and effectiveness, but at what cost to his character and relationships? The question became more urgent when Marcus faced a situation that tested the limits of his new philosophy. A former employee, James Rodriguez, had been injured on one of Marcus's job sites just before the business collapsed. James needed ongoing medical treatment and couldn't work construction anymore. He filed a workers' compensation claim that threatened to drain what little resources Marcus had left. From a purely strategic perspective, the best move was clear. Marcus's lawyers had found technical grounds to challenge the claim. The injury had occurred during a period when paperwork was irregular due to the business crisis. James had also been drinking that day, though not heavily enough to clearly cause the accident. Aggressive legal strategy could probably defeat the claim, leaving James with nothing and Marcus with his resources intact. The old Marcus would have paid the claim regardless of the legal technicalities, believing it was the right thing to do. The new Marcus understood that this kind of thinking had contributed to his downfall. Resources were limited, and every dollar spent on James was a dollar not available for his family's security or his business recovery. James had been a mediocre employee who often showed up late and took shortcuts on safety procedures. Did Marcus owe him a lifetime of support? For 3 weeks, Marcus wrestled with the decision. He reread Machiavelli's words about the necessity of sometimes acting against charity and kindness when the survival of the state was at stake. He studied how successful leaders had handled similar dilemmas. Most had chosen pragmatic solutions that served their primary obligations to their families and organizations. But Marcus also remembered why he had started his business in the first place. Not just to make money, but to create something meaningful, to provide good jobs for people who worked hard, and to build structures that would last. If he won this battle by abandoning those principles, what exactly would he have won? The solution came from an unexpected source, James himself. When Marcus called to discuss the situation directly, he discovered that James wasn't looking for a lifetime payout. He wanted job training for a new career and enough medical support to get back on his feet. Marcus realized he had been thinking about the problem in legal terms when James was thinking about it in human terms. Working together, they developed a plan that served both their needs. Marcus used his industry connections to get James enrolled in a certified electrical training program and arranged for medical payments to be spread over time in manageable installments. The total cost was less than what Marcus would have spent on legal fees, and both men maintained their dignity and relationship. The experience taught Marcus that Machiavelli's principles weren't about becoming ruthless or abandoning all moral considerations. They were about being realistic about power, strategic about goals, and effective about methods. Sometimes this meant making hard choices that looked cold from the outside. But sometimes it meant finding creative solutions that served everyone's interests better than traditional approaches. As Marcus's business began to stabilize and grow again, he found himself becoming a different kind of leader. Employees respected him more than they had before, even though he was less accommodating to personal problems and more demanding about performance. Clients trusted him more because they could see he understood the harsh realities of business and wouldn't make promises he couldn't keep. Competitors took him seriously because they had learned he could be both generous partner and dangerous enemy. But the most important change was internal. Marcus no longer felt like a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He had learned to see the world as it actually was, not as he wished it to be. This clarity was sometimes uncomfortable, but it was also liberating. Instead of hoping that good intentions would protect his family, he now had practical skills and strategic thinking that could adapt to whatever challenges arose. The first phase of Marcus's transformation was complete. He had learned to survive in a hostile environment and to turn weakness into strength. But Machiavelli's teachings suggested that survival was only the beginning. The real challenge was building something that could not only survive temporary setbacks but thrive across generations. That lesson would prove even more difficult and dangerous than anything Marcus had faced so far. #The secret path that turns men into indomitable warriors against life strikes. Marcus Romano had learned to survive, but survival was not victory. 18 months after nearly losing everything, he stood in his new office overlooking the city skyline. His construction company was profitable again, his family was secure, and his reputation was stronger than ever. But Marcus had discovered something unsettling: success built on Machiavellian principles required constant vigilance. The moment he relaxed his strategic thinking, competitors would sense weakness and attack. The revelation came during what should have been a celebration. Marcus had just won the biggest contract in his company's history, a $50 million government project to renovate the city's downtown courthouse. The project would secure his family's future and establish his company among the region's elite contractors. But within hours of the announcement, Marcus received a call that changed everything. "We need to talk," said District Attorney Patricia Wells. Her voice carried the kind of authority that made smart people nervous. "There are questions about how you won that contract. Questions that could become very public very quickly." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He had played by the rules, submitted the lowest qualified bid, and won the contract fairly. But he was learning that in high-stakes business, being innocent wasn't enough. You also had to be politically protected. The meeting took place in D.A. Wells' private office, away from secretaries and recording devices. Marcus arrived with his lawyer, but Wells dismissed the attorney with a look. "This is a conversation between friends," she said, though nothing in her demeanor suggested friendship. "Your bid was very precise. Almost like you knew exactly what numbers the other contractors would submit." Marcus understood the implication immediately. Wells was suggesting he had inside information, perhaps through bribery or political corruption. The accusation was false, but Marcus realized how easy it would be to make it appear true. He had cultivated relationships throughout city government, gathered intelligence about competing companies, and structured his bid based on careful analysis of political priorities and budget constraints. From the outside, this strategic approach could easily look like corruption. "I did my homework," Marcus said carefully. "I studied every public document, attended every city council meeting, and analyzed every previous contract the city has awarded. I won because I understood what you needed better than my competitors did." It was the truth, but Marcus could see that Wells wasn't interested in truth. She was interested in leverage. Wells leaned back in her chair and studied Marcus like a predator evaluating prey. "The thing is, Marcus, winning a government contract isn't just about submitting the lowest bid. It's about being someone the city can trust for the long term. Someone who understands that public service requires certain considerations." She paused meaningfully. "I'm sure you understand what I mean." Marcus did understand, and the understanding filled him with cold rage. Wells was demanding tribute, a payment for allowing him to keep the contract he had won fairly. This was exactly the kind of corruption that destroyed honest businesses and drove good people out of public service. The old Marcus would have been outraged and probably would have done something stupid like threatening to report Wells to federal authorities. But the new Marcus had learned to think before reacting. He studied Wells' position as carefully as he studied any business opportunity. What did she want? What were her vulnerabilities? How could this situation be turned to his advantage instead of his destruction? The answers became clear as he researched Wells' background and political aspirations. Patricia Wells was running for Attorney General in the next election. She needed to appear tough on corruption while also building relationships with powerful business interests who could fund her campaign. Marcus represented both an opportunity and a threat. If she could control him, he would be a valuable ally. If he resisted, she could destroy him as an example of her commitment to fighting corruption. Marcus spent a week developing his counter-strategy. Instead of either submitting to Wells' demands or challenging her directly, he chose a third path that Machiavelli would have recognized. He made himself more valuable as an ally than as an enemy, while simultaneously making himself too dangerous to attack. The first step was intelligence gathering. Marcus hired a private investigator to research Wells' political and financial connections. What he discovered was a web of relationships that made his own strategic networking look amateur by comparison. Wells had used her position to reward friends and punish enemies for years, building a power base that extended far beyond the DA's office. But the investigation also revealed Wells' vulnerabilities. Her campaign was dependent on funding from construction companies and real estate developers who had benefited from favorable treatment in various legal matters. Several of these relationships would not survive public scrutiny. More importantly, Wells' main rival for Attorney General was actively investigating corruption in local government. Any scandal that touched Wells could end her political career. Armed with this information, Marcus requested a second meeting with Wells. This time, he came prepared for a different kind of conversation. Instead of defending himself against her accusations, he positioned himself as someone who could help solve her problems. "I've been thinking about our discussion," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from Wells' desk. "You're right that public service requires certain considerations. I'd like to contribute to those considerations." Wells smiled, thinking she had one. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. A monthly consulting fee would demonstrate your commitment to good government. Say, $10,000? It was a substantial sum, but Marcus had expected something like this. What Wells didn't expect was his response. "I was thinking of something more meaningful," Marcus said. "A contribution to your campaign for Attorney General. Something that shows real commitment to fighting corruption and supporting law and order." He paused, letting her process this shift from extortion to legitimate political support. Of course, such a contribution would need to come from someone with an unblemished reputation. Someone whose business practices could withstand any level of scrutiny. The implication was clear. If Wells wanted his financial support for her campaign, she needed to ensure that no questions arose about his business practices. Marcus had turned the situation inside out, making himself a potential asset rather than a victim. But he wasn't finished. "I've also been thinking about the construction industry's image problem," Marcus continued. "Too many stories about cost overruns, corner cutting, and questionable relationships with public officials. Someone should probably investigate these practices and clean up the industry." Another pause as Wells realized what he was suggesting. Of course, any investigation would need to focus on the real problems, not on companies that are already following best practices. Marcus was offering Wells something better than a monthly bribe. He was offering her a cause that would advance her political career while protecting his business interests. By positioning himself as a reform-minded contractor who supported transparency and accountability, Marcus would become untouchable. Wells couldn't attack him without undermining her own campaign message. The negotiation that followed was subtle and complex, conducted through implications and suggestions rather than direct statements. By the end of the meeting, both parties understood the arrangement. Marcus would become a visible supporter of Wells' anti-corruption campaign, contributing both money and credibility to her political ambitions. In exchange, Wells would ensure that his business practices were never questioned and would even use his company as an example of honest contracting when the subject arose. But Marcus had learned that agreements with people like Wells were only as good as the leverage that enforced them. Over the following months, he quietly documented every aspect of their relationship, every conversation, and every favor exchanged. He also began building relationships with Wells' political rivals, positioning himself as a valuable source of information about corruption in the DA's office. The strategy worked perfectly, but it also taught Marcus something disturbing about the world he was learning to navigate. Success at this level wasn't just about being smart or hardworking. It required a willingness to engage in the same kinds of power games that had destroyed less prepared people. The difference between winning and losing often came down to who was better at managing compromising information and leveraging political relationships. This realization became even more troubling when Marcus discovered that his new success was attracting attention from people far more dangerous than District Attorney Wells. Vincent Torino was a real estate developer with connections throughout the state government and rumored ties to organized crime. Torino controlled several construction companies through complex ownership structures and had a reputation for eliminating competition through methods that went far beyond normal business practices. The first contact came through an intermediary, a well-dressed man named Angelo who claimed to represent potential investors interested in Marcus's company. The meeting took place at an expensive restaurant downtown, the kind of place where business was conducted over handshake agreements and unspoken understandings. Angelo was polite, professional, and absolutely terrifying in his casual discussions of how businesses succeeded or failed based on community relationships. "Mr. Torino admires what you've accomplished," Angelo explained over perfectly prepared veal. "Starting over after losing everything, winning that courthouse contract, building political support. It shows real intelligence and determination." He smiled warmly while delivering words that felt like a threat. "Mr. Torino believes there could be opportunities for mutual benefit. Perhaps your company could handle subcontracting for some of his projects. Perhaps his investors could provide capital for your expansion." Marcus understood that this was not really an offer he could refuse. Torino's opportunities came with obligations that could eventually consume his entire business. But direct refusal would mark Marcus as an enemy, and Torino's enemies had a tendency to face mysterious problems with permits, inspections, and worker safety. Several contractors who had refused Torino's partnership had found themselves out of business within months. But Marcus had also learned that the best defense against powerful enemies was to become equally powerful yourself, through different means. Instead of trying to match Torino's illegal influence, Marcus decided to build legal influence that would make him too valuable to attack. The strategy required patience, careful planning, and a willingness to risk everything on a single bold move. Marcus's opportunity came when the city announced plans for a massive urban renewal project that would reshape the downtown area over the next decade. The project involved not just construction, but complex coordination between federal, state, and local authorities. It required contractors who could navigate political requirements as skillfully as they managed concrete and steel. Most importantly, it offered the chance to build relationships with power centers that even Torino couldn't control. Instead of bidding on individual contracts within the project, Marcus positioned himself as a coordinator who could manage relationships between various stakeholders. He studied every aspect of the urban renewal plan, identifying potential conflicts and bottlenecks before they became problems. He developed solutions that served everyone's interests while advancing his own position. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the federal funding for the project required compliance with complex environmental and labor regulations that most local contractors didn't understand. While his competitors focused on traditional relationship building, Marcus hired specialists in federal contracting and environmental law. He became the contractor that government officials could trust to handle complicated requirements without creating political problems. This expertise proved invaluable when the project ran into opposition from environmental groups and community activists. While other contractors saw protesters as obstacles to overcome, Marcus saw them as stakeholders to be managed. He spent weeks meeting with community leaders, understanding their concerns, and developing modifications that addressed their issues while maintaining project profitability. The result was that Marcus became essential to the project's success. Federal officials trusted him to ensure compliance with regulations. Local politicians trusted him to manage community relations. Even activist groups saw him as someone who would listen to their concerns. This web of relationships made Marcus far more valuable than any single construction company. When Angelo arranged a second meeting to discuss Torino's opportunities, Marcus was ready with a different kind of conversation. Instead of appearing weak and desperate for protection, he projected the confidence of someone who had other options. "I appreciate Mr. Torino's interest," Marcus said calmly. "But I'm not looking for investors right now. My focus is on managing the responsibilities I already have." Angelo's smile became less warm. "Mr. Torino might wonder if you understand how business works in this city. Sometimes companies need protection from problems they don't even know they have." The threat was more direct now, but Marcus had prepared for this moment. "I understand that successful businesses need strong relationships," Marcus replied. "That's why I work closely with federal oversight teams, environmental compliance officers, and community relations specialists. These relationships ensure that my projects meet the highest standards and avoid the kinds of problems that can attract unwanted attention from regulatory authorities." The implication was subtle but clear. Marcus was telling Angelo that any attack on his business would immediately bring federal scrutiny to the entire urban renewal project. This would threaten not just Marcus's interests, but the interests of every contractor, politician, and investor involved in the multi-billion-dollar development. Torino might be powerful locally, but he couldn't afford to wage war against federal authorities and community activists simultaneously. Angelo left the meeting with polite expressions of respect and promises to convey Marcus's position to Mr. Torino. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning of a longer and more complex game. Torino would probe for weaknesses, test his resolve, and look for opportunities to demonstrate the costs of independence. Marcus had won the first round, but the war would continue until one of them achieved clear dominance or found a way to coexist profitably. The personal costs of this constant strategic thinking were becoming apparent to Marcus's family. Sarah noticed that her husband never truly relaxed anymore. Even during family dinners and weekend activities, she could see him calculating angles, assessing relationships, and planning responses to potential challenges. "You're always thinking 3 moves ahead," she observed one evening. "But sometimes I wonder if you remember why you're playing the game." Emma, now 10 years old, had also begun to notice changes in her father. Where he had once been openly affectionate and spontaneous, he was now more careful in his interactions even with family members. Not cold or distant, but measured in ways that suggested he was always aware of being observed and evaluated. "Daddy doesn't laugh as much as he used to," she told Sarah one night, not knowing her parents could hear her talking to her stuffed animals. These observations forced Marcus to confront a troubling question. In learning to protect his family from external threats, was he changing in ways that threatened his relationships with them? The very strategic thinking that had saved their financial security might be eroding the emotional bonds that made security worthwhile. It was a dilemma that Machiavelli himself had acknowledged. The prince who successfully defended his state might find that the methods necessary for defense had transformed him into someone his people no longer recognized or loved. The crisis came to a head during Emma's school play, a simple production where she played a princess who learns that true strength comes from kindness rather than power. Marcus watched his daughter deliver her lines with conviction and innocence, completely believing in the moral lesson she was expressing. After the performance, as other parents talked about their children's futures and dreams, Marcus realized how far he had traveled from the man who would have unreservedly shared those simple hopes. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching her costume crown, Marcus sat with Sarah and tried to explain the impossible balance he was trying to maintain. "Every day, I deal with people who would destroy us without hesitation if they thought it would benefit them," he said. "I can't protect our family by being naive about that reality. But I also can't let myself become someone who would sacrifice what we're protecting." Sarah listened quietly, then asked the question that had been troubling her for months. "When you look at Emma, what do you want her to learn from watching you? How to be strong, or how to be good?" It was a simple question that cut through all of Marcus's strategic complexity. He wanted his daughter to be both strong and good, but he was no longer sure that was possible in the world he had learned to navigate. The answer would require Marcus to evolve beyond even Machiavelli's teachings, finding a path that preserved both effectiveness and character. But first, he would face the greatest test of his transformation, a direct confrontation with Vincent Torino that would determine not just his business success, but the kind of man he would become in the process of defending everything he had built. #The secret path that turns men into indomitable warriors against life's strikes. Marcus Romano had learned to think like Machiavelli, but he was about to discover that true mastery required going beyond the Italian philosopher's teachings. The final test came not as a business challenge or political maneuvering, but as a direct assault on everything he had built and everyone he loved. Vincent Torino had decided that Marcus's independence was becoming too expensive to tolerate. The attack began subtly, as such things always do. Workers on Marcus's job site started reporting unusual safety inspections from officials no one recognized. Suppliers began having delivery problems that delayed critical materials. Subcontractors received anonymous tips about potential tax audits. Each incident was small enough to explain away, but together they formed a pattern designed to squeeze Marcus's operation until it became unprofitable. Marcus recognized the strategy immediately. Torino was applying pressure gradually, allowing Marcus to see what was happening while making it impossible to prove. The message was clear: submit to partnership or watch your business die slowly from 1,000 small cuts. It was the kind of sophisticated campaign that had destroyed dozens of independent contractors over the years. But Marcus had learned something that Torino didn't expect: how to turn weakness into strength by changing the rules of engagement entirely. Instead of responding to each attack individually, Marcus decided to use Torino's campaign as an opportunity to build something that would make him permanently untouchable. The plan was audacious and dangerous, requiring Marcus to risk everything he had gained on a single coordinated strategy. The first step was gathering evidence. Marcus hired a team of private investigators, former federal agents who specialized in documenting organized crime activities. But instead of trying to build a case against Torino directly, Marcus focused on mapping the entire network of corruption that made Torino's operations possible. Which officials took bribes? Which companies laundered money? Which politicians provided protection in exchange for campaign contributions? The investigation took 3 months and cost nearly everything Marcus had saved from his recovery. But the results were devastating: a comprehensive picture of how illegal influence flowed through the city's construction industry, real estate development, and political system. Torino was powerful, but he was also vulnerable because his power depended on dozens of people who could be turned against him if the right pressure was applied. Marcus's second step was even more dangerous. He began building alliances with Torino's enemies. Federal prosecutors had been trying to build cases against organized crime influence in construction for years, but they lacked the inside knowledge necessary to understand how the system actually worked. Marcus offered to provide that knowledge, but not as a cooperating witness who would testify in court. Instead, he positioned himself as a confidential source who could guide investigations toward the most productive targets. The arrangement served everyone's interests. Federal authorities got intelligence that would allow them to build stronger cases. Marcus got protection from people who could neutralize Torino's local influence. Most importantly, Marcus maintained his position in the industry while helping to clean up the corruption that threatened honest contractors like himself. But, the most crucial element of Marcus's strategy was psychological. He needed Torino to understand that any attack on Marcus would trigger consequences far beyond their personal conflict. This required careful orchestration of events that would demonstrate Marcus's new level of protection without revealing the specific mechanisms that provided it. The opportunity came when one of Torino's companies bid on a federal contract for renovating a government building. Marcus's investigation had revealed that the company's bid included inflated costs that would be split between Torino and the corrupt official who awarded the contract. Instead of exposing this directly, Marcus arranged for an anonymous tip to reach the Federal Inspector General's office with enough detail to trigger a full investigation. The investigation not only canceled the contract but led to criminal charges against the official and several associates. Torino's company faced federal scrutiny that would continue for years. More importantly, the case sent a clear message throughout the construction industry: someone was providing federal authorities with detailed information about illegal activities, and that someone had access to very sensitive information. Torino's response was swift and predictable. Within a week, Marcus received a visit from men who didn't bother with polite conversation or business cards. They made direct threats against his family, his employees, and his business. But they also delivered a message that Torino wanted to meet personally to resolve their misunderstanding like civilized men. The meeting took place at Torino's private office in an upscale building downtown. Marcus arrived alone, as requested, but he was far from defenseless. Hidden cameras recorded every word, and federal agents monitored from nearby locations. More importantly, Marcus carried with him the confidence of someone who had carefully prepared for this confrontation. Torino was a large man in his 60s, impeccably dressed and soft-spoken in the way of people accustomed to being obeyed without question. He offered expensive whiskey and spoke warmly about Marcus's family, mentioning specific details about Emma's school and Sarah's daily routines. The implicit threat was clear, but delivered with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "You've caused me some expensive problems," Torino said calmly. "That federal investigation has cost my organization time and money. More importantly, it's created uncertainty that affects all our business relationships." He paused to sip his whiskey, studying Marcus's reaction. "I think you understand that such problems require solutions." Marcus had prepared for this moment by studying everything he could find about Torino's psychology and methods. The man was used to dealing with people who were either terrified or trying to impress him. What he wouldn't expect was someone who showed neither fear nor admiration, but simple professional respect. "I understand that you're facing some challenging legal issues," Marcus replied evenly. "I also understand that these challenges come from choices your organization made without considering the full range of potential consequences." Torino's eyes hardened. "Are you suggesting that I brought these problems on myself?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus could see Torino's bodyguards shifting position slightly, ready to respond to any sign from their boss. "I'm suggesting that the construction industry is changing," Marcus said. "Federal oversight is increasing, community activism is more organized, and environmental regulations are more complex. Companies that don't adapt to these changes face increasingly serious problems." He met Torino's stare directly. "The question is whether we see these changes as obstacles to overcome or realities to work with." It was a carefully crafted response that acknowledged Torino's power while suggesting that this power was becoming obsolete. Marcus was offering Torino a choice: evolution or extinction. But he was making this offer from a position of strength, not desperation. Torino leaned back in his chair, reassessing the man across from him. "You're either very brave or very stupid," he said finally. "I haven't decided which. But I'm curious about what you think working with realities means in practical terms." Marcus had prepared for this question as well. It means building businesses that can thrive under federal scrutiny rather than despite it. It means developing political relationships based on legitimate mutual interests rather than hidden obligations. It means creating value for communities instead of just extracting it. He paused, letting Torino process these concepts. Most importantly, it means choosing partners based on their ability to succeed in the new environment, not just their willingness to play by old rules. The conversation continued for 2 hours, but both men understood that they were negotiating the future of construction in their city. Torino represented the old system of corruption and intimidation that had dominated for decades. Marcus represented a new approach that combined strategic thinking with legitimate business practices. The question was whether these two approaches could coexist or whether one would ultimately destroy the other. The resolution came in an unexpected form. Instead of direct competition or cooperation, Marcus and Torino developed what could only be called strategic separation. Torino would continue to operate through his traditional methods, but in market segments and geographical areas that didn't overlap with Marcus's operations. Marcus would focus on federal contracts, environmental projects, and community development work that required the kind of transparency and accountability that Torino's organization couldn't provide. This arrangement served both their interests while avoiding direct conflict. Torino maintained his existing revenue streams without additional federal scrutiny. Marcus expanded into markets where his legitimacy was an asset rather than a liability. Most importantly, both men understood that violating this informal agreement would trigger consequences that neither wanted to face. But Marcus's real victory was more subtle and more significant than avoiding war with Torino. By standing up to the most dangerous man in the city's construction industry, Marcus had demonstrated to everyone else that change was possible. Other contractors began following his example, building legitimate businesses that could compete on merit rather than connections. Federal oversight became more effective because honest businesspeople were willing to cooperate with investigations. The entire industry slowly began shifting toward practices that served the public interest rather than just private profit. The personal costs of this transformation were significant but not overwhelming. Marcus had learned to compartmentalize his strategic thinking, applying Machiavellian analysis to business and political situations while remaining genuinely warm and spontaneous with his family. The key was understanding that different relationships required different approaches, not that all relationships had to be strategic. Emma noticed that her father had begun laughing again, especially during family time when he consciously set aside his professional concerns. Sarah saw that her husband had found a way to be both strong and good, protecting their family through intelligence and preparation rather than luck or wishful thinking. Marcus himself discovered that true security came not from controlling every situation, but from building the capabilities to handle whatever situations arose. The transformation was complete when Marcus realized that he no longer thought of himself as following Machiavelli's teachings. Instead, he had internalized the philosopher's insights about power and human nature while developing his own approach to applying these insights ethically and effectively. He had become someone who could operate successfully in a corrupt and dangerous world without becoming corrupt or dangerous himself. 3 years after nearly losing everything, Marcus stood once again in his office overlooking the city skyline. But, this time, he wasn't just surviving or even succeeding. He had fundamentally changed how business was conducted in his industry and his community. Federal contracts were awarded more fairly, community concerns were addressed more seriously, and corrupt practices were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The real test of Marcus's transformation came when a young contractor named David Chen approached him for advice. David was facing the same kinds of pressures that had once threatened to destroy Marcus's business. Corrupt officials were demanding bribes, established companies were trying to exclude him from profitable contracts, and he was beginning to wonder if honest business was possible in such an environment. Marcus spent an afternoon with David, sharing not just strategic insights but also the philosophical framework that made those insights effective. "The world isn't fair," Marcus explained, "but that doesn't mean you have to be unfair to succeed. It means you have to be smarter, more prepared, and more strategic than people who rely on corruption as a shortcut." He taught David how to research political relationships, build legitimate alliances, and position himself as valuable to honest officials while making himself too dangerous for corrupt ones to attack. But, most importantly, Marcus emphasized that strategic thinking was a tool for achieving worthy goals, not an excuse for abandoning moral principles. Machiavelli wrote about princes who needed to maintain power to serve their people, Marcus said. Your business isn't just about making money for yourself. It's about providing good jobs, building useful structures, and contributing to your community's prosperity. Never forget why you're fighting, because that's what will keep you from becoming the kind of person you originally set out to defeat. David succeeded in building his own legitimate business, and he eventually taught the same lessons to other young entrepreneurs. A network of ethical but strategically sophisticated businesspeople began emerging throughout the region. They shared information about corrupt practices, supported each other against unfair attacks, and gradually created an environment where honest business became not just possible but profitable. Marcus had learned that true strength wasn't about being the toughest or most ruthless person in any situation. It was about understanding how power really worked, building capabilities that couldn't be easily destroyed, and maintaining the character to use those capabilities for worthy purposes. He had become what Machiavelli had always intended, a leader who could protect what mattered most while remaining someone worthy of protection. The secret path that turns ordinary men into indomitable warriors wasn't about abandoning morality or becoming cynical about human nature. It was about seeing the world clearly, preparing thoroughly, and acting strategically while never losing sight of the values that made victory worthwhile. Marcus had walked that path and emerged not just stronger, but better than the man who had started the journey in the ruins of his failed business. Years later, when people asked Marcus about his transformation, he would smile and recommend that they read Machiavelli's writings carefully. But remember, he would add, the prince's job wasn't just to survive or even to win. It was to build something worth surviving for and worth winning. That's the difference between being a successful leader and being just another person with temporary power. The secret path had led Marcus not just to strength, but to wisdom. And, in teaching that path to others, he ensured that his transformation would outlive his own career, creating a legacy of ethical leadership that would benefit generations of honest people who refused to accept that the world had to remain corrupt and dangerous for those who sought to do good work and build worthy lives.